Johann Sebastian Bach wrote 6 sonatas e partitas senza basso, which means 6 sonatas and partitas without bass, for solo violin in 1720, during the 6-year period in which he was employed as a Kapellmeister by Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Köthen. Köthen was a secular court. Bach was released from the many liturgical duties that had been required of him in previous employment. Therefore, most of the music he wrote during that time was secular and instrumental. The Brandenburg concertos, the Well-Tempered Clavier, French suites, and suites for cello also date from this period. Like the rest of Bach's compositions, they were forgotten after his death. Their revival began with the violinist Ferdinand David, who prepared the complete set for publication in 1843. Famous violinist Joseph Joachim also performed selected movements, helping to make the works more familiar. Incidentally, he was also the first to record them. Felix Mendelssohn issued the Chaconne movement of the D minor partita with an original piano accompaniment, and Robert Schumann issued all 6 sonatas and partitas with piano accompaniment in 1854. Johannes Brahms and Ferruccio Busoni later made piano arrangements for the Chaconne. Nevertheless, it was only in the 20th century that the 6 works took their rightful place among the masterpieces of the violin repertoire. There are 3 sonatas, G minor, A minor, and C major, and 3 partitas, B minor, D minor, and E major. The sonatas are written in the form of sonata da chiesa, church sonata, and the partitas are written in the form of dance suites. Each following sonata is longer and more complex. The fugues are getting longer and more complex as well, from triple chords in the first fugue, G minor, to 4-voice chords in the later fugues. I particularly like how musicologist Stanley Ricci organizes sonatas and partitas. For him, there are improvisatory movements, fugues, ostinato movements, dance-like movements, virtuoso movements, philosophical movements, and lyrical movements. What inspiration had Bach in order to produce such an amazing body of work for solo violin in polyphonical style? We know he grew up listening to his father, Johann Ambrosius Bach, who was a good violinist. We know Johann Sebastian was also a good violinist himself, according to his son, C.P.E. Bach, and I quote, "He played the violin cleanly and penetratingly, and thus he kept the orchestra in better order than he could have done with the harpsichord." It is worth knowing that we have examples of set pieces in polyphonic style for solo violin before Bach. The oldest, Paul Westhoff, Suite for Solo Violin, written in 1683. Franz Bieber Passacaglia, part of Rosary Sonatas, written in 1676. And finally, Pisendel Sonata a violino solo a senza basso, written in 1717. So maybe composing Bach's sonatas and partitas was a result and a natural progression of the development of solo violin repertoire in polyphonic style, but on a much bigger scale as ever written before. The 6 sonatas and partitas are the pinnacle of the violin repertoire because of their complexity and their beauty. Emotionally powerful and passionately involving, these pieces challenge the performer to the limit of his or her technique and musical integrity. Many violinists feel that a lifetime is not long enough to master these great works. They are a source of endless fascination, wonder, and discovery. I would like to share with you what I learned from my teachers, my mentors, what I learned from my thorough research, readings on the subject of Bach, and my own experience of performing these masterworks. I would like to share with you my thoughts in hope that they will make you curious to want to explore sonatas and partitas in depth. The thorough understanding of this style and exploration of Bach's intentions are essential to bring Bach's music to life. Stylistic conscience is first and important step to perform these works well. Question comes to mind: for whom was it written? Did he write it for himself? Was it an educational exercise? Was it a compositional exercise? Music meant to be performed, to be studied? Maybe it was written for the great virtuoso Johann Sebastian Bach, whose solo sonata senza basso Bach surely knew. We can only guess. Harmony. Speaking of harmony in the Sonatas and Partitas of Johann Sebastian Bach, great pedagogue Miriam Fried says you have to analyze and map out the harmonic skeleton. I recommend you have to map out the movement, find the most important intense moment, then second most intense moment, cadences, how many sentences are and how long they are, how many climaxes are and how they relate to each other. Emotional interest and impact comes from beautiful harmonic progression, so you have to think harmonically and chordally. Voicing. Clear voicing is essential for clarity of the harmony. Be aware of the note length. There is a melodic note and accompanying note. The melodic note should be held longer. It probably should be articulated, and you have to be aware of the weight of your bow arm. Here's a beautiful example. In Sonata in G minor, Adagio, beginning phrase, here's the melody line. And of course we have many chords and accompanying notes. There are two places where you should be aware of the note length. So bring out the G and F sharp, much longer than the C, as well here. Really focus on the C natural rather than F sharp. also aware that in arpeggios, voicing is very important. In the chaconne from Partita in D minor, famous long section with the arpeggio, climax of that moment calls for elongating and articulating the melody notes. Melody and ornaments. When you start working on particular movement of sonatas and partitas by Johann Sebastian Bach, it's important to look at the contour of the piece and to first detect and establish what is the melody and what is the ornament. So what are the ornaments? They are the filigrees, trills, mordents, fast-moving 30-second notes or 16 notes, which create the improvised feeling. They are simply accessories that embellish the melody. Examples of early ornaments are Corelli sonatas, and as Rachel Barton Pine suggests, the Roder edition, made in Amsterdam, is a fabulous tool to practice ornaments. This edition puts on each line first ornamented line, then melody line, and then the bass line. It's really useful. So how precisely do we do that? Do we make those ornaments work? We can hold the longer value notes longer, then flow the ornaments notes faster with a sense of motion. Here's an example from Adagio from Sonata in G minor with melody and ornaments. If I would decide to play very metronomically the beginning phrase, it would sound like this. Instead, the performance practice calls for freedom in the flowing of the ornaments. So the interpretation would be more like this. Question comes to mind. Shall we ornament or not? Where to ornament? First of all, dance movements in the partitas, especially in the partitas, invite the ornaments much more than sonatas. It is also acceptable to add the trills even though Bach didn't write them, especially on cadences. Here's a beautiful example from Grave from Sonata in A minor, in which Bach didn't write the trill. lot of players decided to add the trill on the cadence G major dominant going into C major tonic. There are also multiple examples in the fugues where trills are written or not written. In the fugue of A minor sonata, in the first example, Bach decided to write the trill in. In the next example, which is very similar, I would say, he didn't write the trill. Yet a lot of players add the trill there, myself included. It's much more exciting and inviting. We can also add the slurs in the repeats. Slur is a type of ornament. It adds contrast and variety, which was recommended in Bach's time. Here's an example of Gigue from the D minor partita. First appearance of the theme, it's written in separated bows. But when we come back, we can add the slurs and mordents. And here's the repeat. Again, it's much more exciting and it adds great energy and variety. Usually in the ornaments, we don't happen to notice the bass notes, but there is an interesting example of the very long ornament in the grave of Sonata in A minor, in which we have few bass notes. So I would like to show you this example. So we have C, D, A, B, G sharp and A. On the subject of ornaments and the freedom of the flow of ornaments, we can get inspired by listening to the harpsichord version of the A minor sonata and the lute version of E major partita. Bass line and pedal point. In many places in sonatas and partitas, we try to follow the melody line in the soprano voice and underline the bass line at the same time by adding distinctive articulation to the bass line. Awareness of harmonic progression of the bass line and shape of the bass line are of utmost importance. Let's look at Grave from A minor sonata, the very first phrase. Here's the bass line. And if I would be more aware of harmonic progression in that bass line, I would shape it like this. And hear how it sounds all together. Bass line, melody line, and all the chordal structure. Attention should be for melody, bass, harmony, and relationship between them, following all of them. Pedal point. What is a pedal point in music? It's a tone sustained through several changes of the harmony that may be consonant or dissonant with it. In instrumental music, it's typically in bass. What is the role of the pedal points in Bach's music? It is creating tension. So a pedal point is a great composing tool for creating tension. This is because the pedal point is wanting to pull the harmony back to the roots, whilst the changing chords above it are pulling the harmony elsewhere. This harmony battle creates tension, particularly when used in the minor key. One of the roles is also creating excitement. So on the other hand, if you use a pedal point in a major key, you can create excitement, particularly if you use a reasonably fast tempo. A beautiful example of the pedal point, longer pedal point in Sonatas and Partitas is the pedal point D in the first fugue, G minor fugue. Quite interesting and fascinating example of the pedal point is Andante from Sonata in A minor, which the pedal point is basically a second voice. And finally, the biggest example, the longest section with the pedal point. It's in famous Chaconne in the middle section. Chords. Playing chords in Bach, sonatas and partitas is a very complicated issue. No solution is perfect and it requires compromise. It is known that on the violin, one voice instrument, it is impossible to sustain 3 or 4 voice chords. We can only deceive the listener and, as great pedagogue Miriam Fried puts it, create illusion that we can play 3 or 4 voice chords. Adjustments have been made to the modern violin to increase the tension of the strings in relation to different parts of the instrument so as to maximize the sound volume to meet the demands of the large concert halls settings. During Bach's lifetime, violins had shorter fingerboards and lower bridges. Thus, playing double and triple notes was less difficult than the same execution on the modern-day adjusted instruments. Bach's works demonstrate complete mastery of the contrapuntal writing, which requires many voices to be played simultaneously while often retaining the independence of the lines. For example, in the fugues of the 6 sonatas, the various lines interact and should be played as if by separate violinists. Recently, I came across the addition of certain movements of Bach, sonatas and partitas arranged for 2 violinists. I think it's a valued exercise to try to play it with 2 players. It is obvious that the sheer number of chords and their frequency are the most challenging technical issue in the sonatas and partitas. Let's talk about some details. First question, shall we roll chords up or down? In Bach's times, up until 20th century Eugene Isai sonatas, the chords were always rolled up. Trying to physically do it, to roll down 4 voice chords, the gravity tends to work against us and it is much more difficult to achieve satisfying sound result. It is choppy and scratchy. Some editions suggest that, but I don't recommend it. I'll give you example. Here is the place in the fugue of G minor where some editions suggest to roll the chord down, and it's really awkward sounding. The version with rolling chords up is I think it's a better solution. The technique of breaking the chords smoothly is very important. In playing chords, I like to give an image of painting with your hand like a brush with thick paint on it. We are looking for a smooth pulling action. Let's talk about the options and examples of rolling, arpeggiating and broken chords. We have few options to consider. Let's take the first chord of Adagio from G minor sonata. This is a G minor chord. We certainly could roll it 4 strings separately. But you lose a lot of resonance. So I would suggest to, if you want to roll, to try to roll giving impression of some double stops. So here, you could also try to break it with a little bit more resonance. So using first two strings, fifth, and then three other strings. And then you leave the last note single melody note on E string. The chords should not interrupt the flow of melody. Here's example in the fugue of A minor. Here's the melody line. So the timing of the chords is very important. You should not interrupt the flow of melody line. Shall we play the chords on the beat or before the beat? And here I recommend that you analyze each particular place really well, because in some places you can do on the beat or before the beat. We should always have a clear pulse from chord to chord. Here's the example from fugue from A minor sonata. This time I will break the chords before the beat. As long as you're articulating clearly the bass line, you could do this. But a lot of players choose to play it on the beat, and it sounds like this. The analysis of harmony in chords determine the shape of gestures and phrases. One technical issue of chords in sonatas and partitas is that they involve a lot of fifths, which are difficult on the violin. So in analyzing technically the chords, you really have to know how to put the finger on two strings when you play fifth, whether to put weight on lower string or upper string, or in between strings. This is a particular technical issue that a lot of people struggle in playing the chords in Bach. Baroque bow versus modern bow. During Bach's time, players used Baroque bow. Modern bow was invented 30 years after Bach's death, circa in 1780. 80 by François Tourte. Let us start with some specifics and compare the two. I have here two bows. One is a modern bow, one is a beautiful Baroque bow. It's a copy of Stradivari bow, copy made by Andrew Dipper from Claire Given's shop. Baroque bow is curved differently than modern bow. Modern bow is curved inward, so if pressure or weight applied, it will bend. As the Baroque bow stick is stiff and it will not bend. Baroque bow is shorter and has 2/3 of the hair of modern bow. In other words, modern bow has much more hair than Baroque bow. Baroque bow favors heavier playing at the frog and lower half, and natural, lighter, softer at the tip of the bow. The sound is lighter and naturally decays towards the tip. Modern bow sustains the sound much better. They are made of different wood. Modern bow is made of Pernambuco wood and Baroque bow is made of beautiful snake wood. Baroque bow has much more clarity, rhythmic vitality, flexibility, and grace. Therefore, clarity of articulation and transparency of the texture are easily achieved on the Baroque bow. Baroque bow, with its clear resonance and flexible short stroke, is particularly wonderfully suited for the fast movements from sonatas and partitas, such as presto from sonata in G minor or gigue from partita in D minor. Let's listen to the example of gigue from partita in D minor on both bows. This was modern bow. Played on the Baroque bow, it will probably sound a little bit lighter, but clearer. It's easier, it feels very different. In the recent years, modern players experiment with moving the hand bow grip up the stick slightly above the frog and play the sonatas and partitas on modern bow, but with the higher grip. Now I would like to show you examples of two techniques that were used often in the Baroque era and which Bach used in his sonatas and partitas. It's called bariolage and ondeggiando. Bariolage is a technique that uses repeated open strings alternating with melodic line with separating bows. Here's example from Preludio from E major partita. So I'm alternating open E string with melody line on A string. On the giando is a very similar technique. It is repeated open strings alternating with melodic line, but in legato. Here's another example from Preludio from E major partita. Another beautiful example of on the giando is in the famous chaconne. Triple chords are easier and sound lighter on the shorter Baroque bow. Here is example from A minor fugue from A minor sonata, the end of the fugue with its very complex four-voice chords. And now I will play exactly the same excerpt, but on the modern bow, and you will probably see that I struggle a little bit more with the modern bow in the chords. Authenticity for its own sake is usually not a great idea, but in this case works better. One should compare and experiment with how Baroque and modern bow performs its tasks put forth by the music, and at least get the feel of how Baroque bow works. As we know, the bow is the instrument of musical expression. It is always good to choreograph your bow strokes. Variation of point of contact, intelligent planning of bow division, artistic choice of note length, subtle application of tone colors result in more spoken approach than sang. That spoken approach is one of the most essential elements of the Baroque style. Vibrato. There was no continuous vibrato during Bach's time. Continuous vibrato was not acceptable. Higher positions vibrato that players use now in romantic or modern repertoire is connected with certain amount of physical tension that was unknown in the Baroque era. Vibrato was used as ornament only and used logically, meaning to emphasize certain note or a harmony. The purpose of vibrato is ornamentation. interesting harmonic event, dissonant, melodic contouring calls for certain type of vibrato. For example, slow, wider vibrato and slow bow speed is appropriate on the relaxed harmony notes. Faster vibrato, tighter, more centered, will be appropriate on the dissonant notes or chords. There should be no vibrato on weak expressive notes. There should be no slides. Here's beginning of Gavotte from E major partita, in which there is a moment which calls for fast and tight vibrato. So this dissonance calls for really fast and intense vibrato. I always recommend to my students that they should practice sonatas and partitas first without vibrato and learn how to make the sound from the bow. Here is the beginning of Adagio from G minor sonata, completely without vibrato. Manuscript versus editions. Manuscript of Say solo should be studied in awareness that Bach was an excellent violinist. I repeat the quote from the introduction. According to C.P.E. Bach, Johann Sebastian played the violin cleanly and penetratingly, and thus he kept the orchestra in better order than he could have done with the harpsichord. Bach's manuscript is a very detailed musical instruction in the form of precise bowings and slurs. Playing, teaching, and working from the manuscript, like Bach himself, is more truthful and much more inspiring. But, as brilliant Baroque specialist Job Schroeder puts it in his book Bach Solo Violin Works, one should have an attitude similar to French and Italian attitude towards the traffic lights. We should not always respect them scrupulously, but we must always take them seriously into account. We have no concrete information about performances during Bach's time. So the first step would be to study the manuscript, then compare the manuscript and urtext against the edited editions. Noticing the differences between the manuscript and editions adds to your stylistic conscience. Editions are valid. They represent thoughtful conclusions, can be very useful, contain much information about individual playing styles. It is worth mentioning that Bach autograph went into obscurity for many years. It took 52 years after Bach's death for the first edition to be published. Example from Andante from A minor sonata shows us that we have some freedom to interpret Bach's bowing. In the Andante, Bach suggests playing all the 8 notes separate. It's slightly difficult and many players decide to slur to 8 notes. And it sounds like this. Many editions put the Bach's manuscript in the book itself. Galamian edition puts it at the very end of the book. Polish edition by Wronski places the parts of the manuscript against the edition page by page, which is very helpful for comparing exactly page by page.